Hi, I'm Thomas Misiukanis from Steamhouse, here with ComSun in Las Vegas for reInvent. And joining me today is Jeremy Daly. Jeremy, thanks ever so much for coming along. I know.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. I realise most people probably will know who you are, but for those who are new to serverless, new to AWS,
Sure.
Please could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Jeremy Daly. I'm the CEO at a new startup called Ampt. I used to be at Serverless Inc. for the last couple of years, building a product out called Serverless Cloud. Before that, though, I basically have been a developer since 1997. So I'm 25 years in tech, ran a web development company for 12 years, got sick of building things for other people, went into the super easy world of starting your own startup. So I was, CTOs, VPs of product, a lot of things with development, but also a lot of things on the business side as well. But in about maybe 2009, I started using the cloud when I started doing a new startup, and so got into AWS, built a whole bunch of cool things there, and then when I discovered Lambda in 2015, the rest is kind of history. I started writing about it. I became an AWS serverless hero. I started a newsletter that off by none every Tuesday. You can sign up for that. Excuse me. And a podcast. So I do the Serverless Chats podcast as well, and I have a bunch of open source things, and I speak. I don't know. I do way too much, so that's why I can barely talk, because I just run myself down.
Brilliant. Yeah. I imagine it's been a very busy week for you so far.
It has, yes.
So you've already touched on it, but I'm interested, similar background, but scaled back quite a lot, should we say, as a developer, coming to serverless myself. So I wondered if there was a particular project or a spark that kind of ignited your curiosity, your interest, and then obviously your love for serverless.
Yeah, so it was actually back in 2015. We were building. I was at another startup. I was the VP of product there, and we were building out this shopping app. And we were going to get featured on, I think it was the Today Show or Good Morning America. I think it was the Today Show. So we knew we were going to get featured. So we had to make sure that we had enough capacity, and we were all ready to go. Now we were all in AWS Cloud. We were using DynamoDB, but we had like sharded MySQL tables. This was back in 2015, so before people were doing serverless. And then on that day, we kept on asking, we're like, is this going to scale? Is this going to scale? We were load testing everything, no problem. Then we had 10,000 signups in 30 seconds. And the single point of failure was it was all tied to a single database table for the user authentication. So when the user signed up, right, that wasn't in DynamoDB. So it basically overwhelmed the writes that shut down all the reads. And so essentially even existing users couldn't log in. So we lost out on a huge opportunity, had a huge retrospective, like what went wrong and the whole deal. And so we started looking at like what are these different things you can do. So I started digging through AWS and what were the options available. I came across this thing called AWS Lambda, and I'm like, what's this all about? So started playing around with it, started exploring it. As soon as I kind of grokked what it was trying to do, I'm like, this is going to be the future of the cloud. On-demand compute is going to be the future of the cloud. It's going to be an absolute game changer. So from there, they just started adding things. I mean, this was before VPC support. Actually, I discovered it before API Gateway existed. So like, there's all these crazy things, but it's just become so big now, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. And that's what Ampt is all about, deploying architectures that are as serverless as possible for you. So it's been amazing, but I've absolutely fell in love with it.
Great, fantastic. And I think probably a very familiar story for a lot of people who have adopted serverless is that point of failure, and quite often it tends to be, I think, databases where even if you start with serverless, you start scaling, but then you've got that single point of failure that will bring the house crashing down. So you had a talk this week.
I did.
Unleashing developer potential with infrastructure as code. Could you give us
infrastructure from code?
Oh, sorry. Infrastructure, the important distinction.
Yes, very important distinction. I'll just give you a little recap of it. So essentially, infrastructure as code using something like CloudFormation or Terraform, or even if you're using an imperative approach like the CDK or Pulumi or something like that, those are great services, and you have a lot of control over what you spin up and so forth. But I look at those as control plane specific instructions. It's like machine code for the cloud, and nobody writes machine code when they're building applications, right? But we have to write machine code for the cloud. So what we did at Serverless Cloud about 2 years ago is we discovered this thing where we said there's a lot of duplication and a lot of drag when you're writing an application in the cloud, where you have to write your application code, but then you have to write infrastructure as code in order to tell it how to actually run your application, what services you need, what resources you need. So we said, what if you didn't need the infrastructure as code, and you could just take your application code and figure out what you needed to run it. All these patterns are available to us. We've been using them for 7 years now in serverless, and they're keeping our new ones all the time. So what we did is we basically analyzed the code, we turned that into the optimal infrastructure and in the most serverless way possible, and we give you this full developer experience where you make a change, and of course the great thing about serverless is you should be able to spin up a developer environment and tear it down, spin it up, tear it down, spin it up, tear it down, run tests against it, whatever. So we give every developer their own developer environment. They can go ahead and spin that up, and then they can go ahead and deploy that to their AWS account or to our AWS accounts, whatever. But so the point is that infrastructure from code is literally just writing application code, JavaScript, TypeScript. And what that opens up for you is things like self-provisioning, self-optimization, self-testing, self-discoverable endpoints, self-auditing. I mean, think of all the different selves that you can have in front of that, but essentially, and watch the video because I'll remember them better in the video. But essentially, you have that a tremendous amount of power when you separate your business logic from the infrastructure that it's running on. So rather than you writing your infrastructure and then writing code against that infrastructure, you're writing code, and then the code and the system that we've built figures out what that infrastructure is that's needed to run it. So it's a big shift in the paradigm. We don't expect that it'll cover all the use cases, but for a fair amount of the use cases that you do in the cloud, this is hyper productive for the developers. It's very easy to change, super easy to grok, and the learning curve is super low. So it's pretty exciting, yeah. So infrastructure from code is this interpretive approach as opposed to declarative or imperative that reads your code and figures out how to basically deploy that app most optimally in the cloud, and then over time optimize it, right? So it's like maybe a Lambda function works today, but maybe tomorrow we want to run that to App Runner because it's high velocity throughput or something like that. So.
Yeah, and so I think it kind of it hands a lot of power back to developers where they've got freedom and they can experiment, they can try things.
Well, and think about this too. Like, I mean, we had a lot of questions actually after the session that were about, these were SREs. We're like, well, how do we put security in there? And I want control and whatever. If you think about the modern way we're building applications, we're not writing application code anymore. We're basically composing together services, right? So if you're composing all these services together, the developer, it's tightly coupled. When you write code, it's tightly coupled to the infrastructure runs. So even if you're building things like dead letter queues or failovers or even all like event pipes that just came out, like all these things, they require the developer to be able to interact and configure the infrastructure directly, right? So SREs are going to lose that control anyways, and the developers have to take that responsibility of understanding it. So what we're trying to do is say, look, all of that complexity behind the scenes, those are like systems, like the subsystems of a computer. And if the cloud's the computer, it needs a new operating system, and that's what we're trying to do with infrastructure from code and Ampt.
Great, sounds fantastic. So it's been spun out of Serverless Cloud.
Yep.
So could you just touch on some of the differences between and essentially why it's now its own standalone product?
Yeah, so Serverless Cloud was originally concepted to be a PaaS for the serverless framework. So if you're familiar with the serverless framework, it's got about 90% market share. A lot of, anybody who's building a serverless app is most likely using the serverless framework to do it. Great service, but everyone kind of ran into that thing where it's like you go to publish and they say, what are your AWS credentials? And people are like, oh, well, I don't know if I want to give it to you, or they don't want to sign up for AWS. So what we tried to do with Serverless Cloud was build a PaaS that allowed you to deploy that framework, your framework app, into our own cloud. But what we quickly realized is that sort of that dissonance between writing, the framework code and writing application code. So we switched gears and started going down this different path of the infrastructure from code. So once we started doing this, it just, we hired a bunch more developers. We've been working on it. We add all kinds of features. We have so many amazing design partners that we're working with to try to figure out their use cases and make sure we optimize them. And so it just got to a point where we realized, this is much different than the mission of Serverless Inc. and what the serverless framework and what their serverless console product is doing. This is just a completely different mission. And we really wanted to separate this out so this could kind of, sort of stand on its own and have the time and the dedication and the focus to grow as an independent sort of paradigm shift, not just a company for building serverless applications. So we spun that out, and the interesting differences between them is, I don't want to say we were limited by our integration with the serverless framework and Serverless Inc., but we built things, we had a product strategy where we had like serverless data, serverless storage, serverless events. So they were kind of abstracting away the cloud, so you didn't really know. It was a little black boxy, and that was fine. It worked really, really well. But what we're trying to do with Ampt is we want it to be very, very open. What we essentially want to do is take the code that you write, and then if you were to hand that off to some super smart cloud person who could take that and turn turn it into a smart architect, take that and build the most optimal architecture to run that code in the cloud for you. That's essentially what our engine does. And it's like, I don't want to say it's just a deployment engine, because it's entirely integrated developer workflow, right? So everything from writing your code to testing your code and having that fast feedback loop, to being able to publish your code, and then actually to manage your code through our interface that gives you like high-level metrics and some other things like that. But we expose the underlying architecture, that best practice architecture that we develop for you or that we deploy for you. That's available. You can see. You want to wire Datadog, you want to wire Honeycomb, or any of those to those, you can do that. So it sort of like gives you that blueprint, but there's a couple of services that launched this week that sort of talk about blueprints and stuff like that, but you have to choose that blueprint and then write your code against the blueprint. This is you're writing your code, and we generate the blueprint from your code, and still give you the most optimal way to do it. So it's really exciting. We've got a long way to go. There's a lot of stuff that we're doing, but we're in the process of relaunching the new Ampt platform. That'll be out hopefully sometime early February next year. If you still want to go and try Serverless Cloud, you can sign up there. Just hit me up on Twitter with a DM or email me or whatever, and I can get you access into the old Serverless Cloud, because we still want people to try it out and whatever. But yeah, no, we're excited about it, and it's a mind shift. And a lot of SREs are like, where's my control? And it's like, look, you're going to have more control because you can spend your time working on the really hard problems. Let us solve 90% of that heavy lifting for you, for your marketing automation team or for your sales automation team, or people who don't need to go deep into the cloud. They just want to use those use cases that are very standard and accepted, and we know what the right way to handle those are, and then use your cloud geniuses to figure out that really, really hard problem in the cloud, and then you move even faster.
And I mean, for me, that just hits serverless on the head. That is what it is. There are standard things we do again and again and again and again.
Right.
As developers, as SREs, we don't need to do that.
Correct.
Let's spend our time focused on what we need to achieve as a business.
Preaching to the choir.
Well, Jeremy, thanks very much. It's been great to meet with you. Great to speak to you, and
so
really
much.
appreciate your time.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.